Ladies and gentlemen, Robert Downey Jr.
Robert Downey Jr. does not usually go out of his way to pick a fight with an entire generation of content creators, but that is essentially what happened in the spring of 2026, when the 61-year-old actor sat down for an episode of the podcast Conversations for Our Daughters and, almost offhandedly, dismantled the idea that influencers are the future of stardom. He was not asked to weigh in on a scandal or defend a movie. He was simply talking about fame, and somewhere in that conversation he said that when people tell him influencers are going to be the stars of tomorrow, he does not know what world they're living in, because to him that idea is complete nonsense. It was blunt, it was unscripted, and within days it had spread across entertainment outlets and social media, because of who was saying it. This is a man who has spent decades inside the machinery of celebrity, who has watched it chew people up and who has been chewed up by it himself more than once, and when someone with that resume dismisses an entire modern industry in a single breath, people listen. But the quote itself was really just the headline. What made his comments worth sitting with was everything underneath them, the specific reasoning he gave, the personal story he attached to it, and the strange fact that a man once written off as unemployable is now the one lecturing the culture on what real substance looks like. To understand why his words landed the way they did, it helps to remember exactly what kind of career, and what kind of collapse, he had to survive to get here. Downey's relationship with fame did not begin normally. He was cast in his father's independent films as a young child, appearing in projects like Pound in 1970, and he grew up around a Greenwich Village creative scene that was steeped in the counterculture of the era, including its heavier vices. His father struggled with substance abuse for years, and Downey has spoken publicly about how normalized drug use was in his household from an extremely young age. That environment did not simply expose him to fame from an unusual angle, it also planted the seeds of an addiction that would define, and nearly destroy, the next 3 decades of his life. By his 20s he was a working actor with real critical momentum, drawing attention for his performance in Less Than Zero in 1987 as a young man spiraling through addiction, a role he later admitted mirrored his own life uncomfortably closely. The praise kept coming. In 1992 he earned an Academy Award nomination for playing Charlie Chaplin, a performance built on months of meticulous physical and musical preparation, and for a moment it looked like he was about to become one of the defining actors of his generation. Instead, the following years turned into one of the most publicly documented downward spirals in Hollywood history. There were multiple arrests through the late 1990s, including a 1996 incident on Pacific Coast Highway in Malibu where police found illegal drugs and a firearm in his vehicle, and further arrests and probation violations that culminated in a 1999 sentencing to California's Substance Abuse Treatment Facility in Corcoran. He served time as an actual state prisoner, something exceedingly rare for an actor of his profile, and even after his release the relapses continued, costing him high-profile jobs including his role on the television series Ally McBeal, which let him go after another arrest in 2001. For a stretch of years, Hollywood effectively considered him uninsurable, which in industry terms meant unemployable, because no studio could get a bond company to cover him. It took people willing to personally vouch for him, including actor and director Mel Gibson, who covered Downey's insurance costs out of his own pocket for The Singing Detective in 2003, to give him a real second chance. That same year, on the set of Gothica, he met producer Susan Downey, and by his own account, meeting her and eventually getting sober for good became the turning point that let him rebuild not just his career but his life. He has been candid that he does not think that relationship would have worked if she had understood the full scope of what she was walking into, and that admission says something honest about how close to the edge he had actually been. From there, the comeback built slowly and carefully rather than overnight. Roles in films like Zodiac and Charlie. Bartlett in 2007 let him prove, project by project, that he could be trusted again, often specifically because those characters shared uncomfortable overlap with his own history with substance abuse, which critics noted gave his performances an unusually raw authenticity. Then in 2008 came the gamble that changed everything, when director Jon Favreau pushed hard to cast him as Tony Stark in Iron Man, a decision plenty of studio executives thought was reckless given his record, especially since Marvel Studios was financing the film itself and could not afford a costly misstep on its very first self-funded production. Favreau's confidence turned out to be justified almost immediately. Iron Man opened to numbers that stunned the industry, and Downey's take on Tony Stark, sharp, funny, and unpredictable in a way that felt genuinely lived in rather than performed, became the connective tissue that let an entire cinematic universe grow around him over the following decade. He rode that momentum through the Avengers films, becoming one of the highest-paid actors in the world in the process, reportedly earning tens of millions of dollars off back-end deals on the biggest installments, while the franchise itself grew into one worth tens of billions of dollars globally. He closed out that chapter with Avengers: Endgame in 2019, delivering the line that became the emotional capstone of the entire saga, a line that reportedly was not even part of the original script but came together on set as a deliberate echo of the very first Iron Man film. Years later, he added an unexpected new layer to his legacy by winning the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor for playing Louis Strauss in Oppenheimer in 2024, a controlled, quietly cutting performance that proved he was not just a franchise star but a serious dramatic actor who had fully rehabilitated his reputation from the ground up, closing the loop on a story that began with a man sitting in a prison cell 25 years earlier. That is the man who, in 2026, decided to speak candidly about influencer culture, and it is worth understanding why his specific framing was more thoughtful than a simple insult. He did not argue that all influencers are talentless or that social media itself is the problem. What he actually said was that in past eras, breaking into entertainment was genuinely difficult, competitive in a way that filtered people, whereas today someone can build a form of celebrity by doing little more than turning a phone camera on themselves. Crucially, he framed that shift not purely as a negative, but as something that raises the bar for what he called the challenge of individuation, meaning the work of becoming a genuinely distinct person with something real to offer, rather than someone who is simply visible. That distinction matters, because it reframes his comments from a bitter older celebrity complaining about the internet into something closer to a specific critique about substance versus visibility. He also brought a personal example into the conversation, revealing that his own teenage son had briefly gotten pulled into that world, to the point where he was ready to send money to an influencer just because he enjoyed watching him play video games. Downey described that particular dynamic as something that can start to function almost like a religion for young fans, and he compared parts of the influencer ecosystem to what he called the evangelical hucksters of the information age, a sharp phrase suggesting that some of these online relationships prey on emotional attachment the same way certain manipulative preachers historically did. That comparison is what really pushed the story beyond a passing quote and into a genuine cultural conversation, because it reframed influencer culture not just as shallow entertainment but as something with real psychological pull over young audiences, something worth being skeptical of the same way people are taught to be skeptical of other systems designed to extract money and loyalty through emotional manipulation. Despite how pointed that comparison was, Downey did not end the conversation on pure cynicism. He acknowledged that plenty of the influencers he has personally encountered are, in his words, genuinely good people, and he expressed hope that a meaningful portion of the next generation will eventually push back against the emptier corners of that culture on their own, choosing instead to build something, create something, or educate themselves rather than chase visibility for its own sake. That final note is arguably the most important part of his comments, because it means his critique was not really an attack on young people or on the internet as a concept. It was a specific warning about the difference between being seen and being someone worth seeing, a distinction he is uniquely positioned to make given his own history. He even turned the lens on himself in that same conversation, admitting that when people tell him they love how off-the-cuff and authentic he seems in public, he privately knows that even that perceived spontaneity requires a level of manufactured effort, and that he deliberately keeps his own social media presence limited because he worries that casually documenting his life online risks creating a version of himself that is not fully real. That kind of self-awareness is rare from someone at his level of fame, and it is part of what gave his broader comments credibility rather than making them sound hollow or hypocritical. It is worth remembering the timing of all this too. These comments came out just weeks before Downey was set to return to the Marvel Cinematic Universe in a completely different role, stepping into the villainous Doctor Doom for the highly anticipated Avengers: Doomsday, a casting decision that had already ignited plenty of debate among fans when it was first announced in 2024. So at the exact moment the entertainment world was already paying close attention to him because of that transformation, he used a separate, quieter platform to say something that ended up generating just as much conversation, if not more, than the blockbuster news itself. There is a certain symmetry in that. Here is a man who spent his 20s and 30s as a cautionary tale about excess and self-destruction, who lost roles, freedom, and public trust because he could not manage the pressures fame put on him, now standing on the other side of it all as someone lecturing the culture about the difference between chasing attention and building something that actually lasts. He is not speaking as an outsider looking down on modern fame. He is speaking as someone who nearly lost everything to an earlier, more chaotic version of celebrity, who understands intimately how quickly public adoration can turn into public humiliation, and who knows firsthand that surviving fame requires something more durable than visibility alone. That is likely why his comments resonated the way they did. It was not just that a famous person criticized influencers, which happens constantly and usually fades within a news cycle. It was that this particular famous person had already lived through the worst version of what happens when someone chases the spotlight without the substance to sustain it, and clawed his way back from rock bottom not through manufactured content but through years of difficult, unglamorous work rebuilding trust one small role at a time. Whether or not people agree with every word he said, the fact that his warning came from someone who has publicly failed, publicly recovered, and publicly succeeded again gives it a weight that a simple online hot take never could. It is also worth noting what he did not say, because that restraint is part of what separated his comments from a typical celebrity rant. He did not claim that every influencer lacks talent, and he stopped short of suggesting the entire format should be dismissed outright, choosing instead to draw a line between visibility as an end goal and visibility as a byproduct of doing something genuinely worthwhile. That is a more difficult argument to make than simple mockery, because it requires acknowledging that the tools of modern fame are not inherently the problem, while still insisting that the people using them owe themselves something more substantial than follower counts and donation prompts. Coming from almost anyone else, that argument might have read as generic wisdom about hard work and authenticity, the kind of thing celebrities say in interviews without much personal stake behind it. Coming from Downey, a man whose own name was once printed next to booking numbers rather than movie titles, whose insurability was a genuine industry question rather than an abstraction, and whose comeback took the better part of a decade of small, unglamorous roles before anyone trusted him with something as big as Iron Man, it carries a different kind of authority. In an entertainment landscape that is constantly shifting toward faster, cheaper, more disposable forms of visibility, Robert Downey Jr.'s message essentially amounted to a reminder that longevity has always required more than exposure, and that the hardest part of building a real career was never getting noticed, it was surviving what comes after, staying worth watching once the initial novelty of being seen has worn off, and figuring out who you actually are once the cameras, for better or worse, refuse to look away.